Scott, Rev and I have been talking for the last 2 hours about this reality that we're living in different universes. Trump gives a speech in Columbia last night. Half the country believes it was a resounding success. I mean, you can't believe how energetic and enthused people were. He was at peace. He was at home. He was comfortable being in his own skin. And then there's an alternate narrative. He was the most hateful and spiteful and vengeful person. Are we've always been polarized. We've always been opinionated. We've always been divided. That's why we have Republicans get elected, and then we have Democrats get elected. But what's different now, if anything is?
I mean, what I'm seeing here is the disappearance of the middle. I mean, this is not the first time we've seen a decline of civility. We can look at the years before the Civil War. And in fact, Representative King out of Iowa just recently said that he thinks we're heading toward a civil war, which really concerns me. I don't see it happening. But in any case, the decline of the middle, the idea that if you're a compromiser, if you're a moderate, if you're willing to reach across a political aisle, that you're the enemy. And so this polarization takes place where any willingness to compromise is tantamount to surrender. And it seriously concerns me where this country's going.
Scott, I make very few thoughtful points. But the most thoughtful point I think I've made in recent shows and in recent time is when I argue that nobody saw Trump coming. A few of us did. But when he got elected president, there had to be, in my humble opinion, a realization of certain political forces that needed to be introspective, that needed some self-evaluating, that needed to say, hey, man, how did this happen? How did this guy who has never held political office, who a lot of us consider to be indecent and vulgar and out of control and lacks the necessary political curiosity or intellectual curiosity, for that matter, to assume the leader of the free world and that role and responsibility. But instead of doing that, Scott, and here's where I take exception with the left and the elites and establishment for that matter, instead of doing that, instead of honestly trying to debate internally or within themselves, how did this happen? It was immediately all hands on deck. Let's make sure it never happens again. Let's impede his progress. Let's make life difficult, not just for him, but his supporters, the people that didn't know any better, that voted for Donald Trump. I've used the word yesterday and today, and I want to get your take on this. It's almost like the Trump supporter, the Trump voter, is being told by the organized forces in politics that they're guilty of something. You're guilty of allowing this guy to be president. Why do we have that big a disconnect? And do you agree with me that the left and the elites and the establishment lacked the introspection necessary to properly evaluate how the most unlikely person imaginable ended up in the White House?
Well, let's start with the second one first, and that is, I mean, it did come as a shock. I would say it's the greatest upset in American political history since at least 1948. I mean, Dr. Thigpen and I were in this room with you talking about we both believed that Hillary Clinton was going to win, probably get over 300 electoral votes, and then all of a sudden this shocking upset occurs. And so we on this show have engaged in introspection. Why did this happen? And looked at the various reasons why this occurred. But as for this idea of that the left is trying to impede Donald Trump, I would point out to you that this polarization didn't just begin at the day after the election in 2016. This has been going on for a while. Those on the left could point out to efforts by Republican-controlled Congress to impede what Barack Obama was doing. We could go back. I interviewed Pat Schroeder for my book on Gerald Ford. I'm plugging the book again. And she talked about how Newt Gingrich did everything possible to impede efforts at compromise and contribute to the polarization taking place in Congress. And so this idea that one side's trying to impede the other is not a new idea. This has been around for at least 20 years.
But, Scott, never before have voters been felt or made to feel guilty about their support of a candidate. You're right. We've had the impediments to progress. Republicans try to slow walk a Democrat agenda. Democrats try to slow walk a Republican agenda. I'm not talking about the agenda. I'm not talking about the presidency. I'm talking about the group of people who hate Trump. And there's a universe out there that just finds everything he does offensive, vulgar, indecent. And then you've got a group of people who cheer on everything this guy does. That's unfair to the process. What I'm arguing, though, is the next step. When Sarah Huckabee Sanders goes to eat dinner with her family and she's told to leave, not because she's misbehaving, not because she's showing too much cleavage or because somebody in her family is acting like an idiot. She's asked to leave because she's a Trump supporter. I don't know there's a precedent to that in recent American political times.
Well, a couple of things. You're talking about trying to denounce Trump. I mean, we could look at Barry Goldwater and how his opponents, political opponents, the Johnson campaign, for instance, said, in your heart, you know he's nuts. And if you vote for Goldwater, we're going to have war with the Soviet Union. So again, that's
so you think that's similar to what we're dealing with today
in terms of trying to appeal to that idea that if you vote for this guy,
how
you're
can
guilty
you do that?
Yeah, exactly.
Okay,
but this idea, what you're talking about, is being exclusionary. We're excluding someone because of their political views, but we could look at all kinds of examples in this country of being exclusionary. The way that African Americans were treated in this country is an example of that. So there's a history there. What concerns me is what I think you're getting to is a deeper issue, and that is the lack of decorum and the lack of civility. The idea that two people with opposing viewpoints can sit in a radio studio together like we do and have a civil discussion about issues that divide us, and try, maybe even in the process, to find some kind of middle ground where we can have that discussion and maybe solve issues, or at least suggest ways of solving them. That has become the wrong way to go. That instead what you need to do is to stand up and say, you're evil, you're bad, get out of here.
Okay, there are several intellectual debates being had in America today. Don't involve me because they're intellectual debates. You'd be very much at home in some of those conversations. But they're about the potential breaking up of America. And that sounds far-fetched. But if we continue to tribalize ourselves and we continue to silo ourselves in certain neighborhoods and political beliefs, and we debate the states' rights, and states should be able to dictate their fate and future on the side of the federal government. But I think there's a serious consideration to be had about this debate now. What if we have gotten to a point? What if this country has gotten to a point that the divisions are so deep and irreconcilable that we're not able to resolve in the fashion we always have? Well, what do we do if that's the case, Scott? Because nothing's forever. I mean, you know that, and I know that. Nothing lasts forever. That there is nothing in the world that always has been and always will be, unless you're a person of faith, and that is the security of an Almighty. But 235 or 40 years as a nation, trials and tribulations, successes and failures. But what happens if we're at the beginning or with the precipice of a new order of which we can't reconcile?
Well, I mean, if you want to go to the extreme, it's what King is talking about.
Is that far-fetched?
For me personally, I think that's going a little too far.
Okay.
Yeah, I don't see that happening. What I do fear, though, is that we could begin to see the breakdown of this experiment, this 235-year experiment in Republican democracy. And this is something the Founding Fathers greatly worried about. Scott,
they didn't think it was going to last forever.
Well, but they hoped they would be able to find ways to make it last. I mean, James Madison did not foresee the possibility of a two-party system. What he wanted was multiple parties that would require various groups in America to have to compromise, to come together, so that for the benefit of the nation. My concern is that we could end up seeing a loss of faith in democracy, and I think we're seeing that, although people may not admit it. And what does that open the door to? It opens the door to autocracy, dictatorship, one-party rule, and that really concerns me, because that takes us down a slippery slope into places I don't think this country wants to be.
But is that Trump's fault, or is Trump a byproduct of that suspicion that the public has about the way we're being governed?
I think it's a combination of things. I think part of it is this growing anger with the establishment, the feeling that...
Are you aggravated with the establishment?
Oh, I have anger at the establishment, absolutely. I mean, I've talked about a constitutional convention. Yeah, I think that there's need for change out there. And the frustration that Americans feel that every time we think we finally made some changes in Congress, for instance, those new lawmakers, that revolution, if you will, those lawmakers become part of the establishment and only care about themselves and not the well-being of the average American person. And Trump was able to feed into that. And I think Trump has fed into it further by, and I'm not saying he's alone in this, but by taking these positions where the idea of decorum and civility is thrown out the window. It definitely attracts his base, but it also legitimizes the idea that it is okay to hit somebody just because you don't like them. It is okay to throw someone out of a restaurant just because you don't like that person's political point of view. And if this continues, then yes, I see this further loss of faith in democracy and the move toward autocracy and dictatorship.
Okay, what do you make, and I'm very interested in your opinion of this, what do you make of the political reality? We can have opinions. You've got them, I've got them, Rev's got them, Alec has them. We express those opinions, some more articulate than others. But there's something about politics that basically boils down to numbers. You know, somebody today in the governor's race will get more votes than the other. That's who will win the race. There's a couple of polls competing out there. One has a turnout model of a more weighted upstate vote than the other. That's the reason one will win or the other. Somebody will get more votes. I want to break this down. I'm very interested in your comments to this. 91% of the coverage on Donald Trump is negative. I mean, that's a number. That's not a number that I've made up. That's a CBS, that's an NBC Wall Street Journal number. 91% of the coverage of Donald Trump could be considered negative. With that being said, if 91% of the coverage of Donald Trump is negative for a week or so, and some of this is self-inflicted, no doubt, they have made dramatic and drastic missteps in handling the illegal immigration debate. But when 91% of the coverage is negative, and we've been told for a week that Trump wants to rip children from the arms and possession of their parents, and his approvals go up and his disapprovals go down. As not the biggest Trump fan in the room, how do you rationalize that? How do you look at the narrative that's been told for over a week and the fact that during that narrative, apparently, you talked about his base. The base is getting a little bit bigger. The base was 32 or 3. Now it's 42 or 3. Now I believe there's 33% of the country in lockstep with Donald Trump. If he robbed a bank, they'd help him with the getaway car. And there's probably 15 or 18% that can waver, that can be for him one week and not so much for him the next week. But in the past week, there's been a real negative tilt to the coverage of Donald Trump. He's the guy responsible for this humanitarian issue on the border. But Scott, his numbers have improved during that time. Help me understand that.
He has been successful in leading the debate, if you will. Pew Research had a poll that came out in January of 2017 that found that immigration ranks 6th among the most important issues to Americans. Race and race relations, the economy, healthcare were above immigration. This month, Pew Research put out a poll and found that of those issues, immigration is now number 1. Trump has found a way to move the debate in directions that have allowed him to stay in the news, that have been able to fire up his base, and that. But Scott, it's not just immigration,
and it's not just his base anymore.
Right. I mean, we can look at
these
the economy.
Are independent. When you look at the independents, and I read the Pew Research, when you look at the independents, more independents favor the job he's doing as American president. All the while, he's getting 91% negative news coverage. Well, and from your perspective, it's easy for me to rationalize because I'm a Trumper. I'm a guy who supports Trump. You don't. I want to hear why you believe that has become a political reality.
Well, again, throughout the economy is another reason why this has been working in his favor. Now that could change because of the new tariff wars that are taking place and what impact that can have upon at least segments of Trump's base, such as farmers in the Midwest, Harley-Davidson workers in Wisconsin, and the like. And I think also that you may be onto something, that there is this new reality, if you will. The idea that 10 years ago, a Donald Trump probably would have been we would have said absolutely not.
We're not going to tolerate that.
Right. That the idea of the person who comes in and throws decorum out the window, throws civility out the window, well, that's okay now. Because part of it could be we just see it in our daily lives now, whether it be through reality TV or other TV shows or what we read about in the newspapers or video games or the like. And I don't want to say that they're all to blame for this. I mean, we could look at also the American family, and what emphasis do families place on on issues like civility and decorum. I mean, there's all kinds of stuff we can throw into the mix here, and I know I'm probably getting myself in some trouble here.
Not at all.
But I think that it has in some ways become the new norm, and this is why Americans will look at Donald Trump and say, well, I don't like the way he says it, but I like what he says. at least he's being straightforward with me. He's not mincing words. And so while there may be issues with some things he says or does, overall I like him.